Thank you. Thanks very much, Mark. Yes, so I've spent about 2 years writing this book, and I was just saying earlier that I thought I'd finished it last Christmas, and then on Christmas Eve, Nature published this paper saying that Denisovans had interbred with modern humans, so I had to go and rewrite most of a chapter in the book. And it's been like that all the way through, so it's an exciting time. I think a lot of you would have heard John Hawkes recently as well. So we'll be covering some of the same areas, but obviously I've got my own perspective on things compared with John. And it really is a fantastically exciting time to be working on modern human evolution, because almost every week there's some exciting new find or publication. So when we look at the origin of our species, Homo sapiens, we've got two kinds of origins to consider. So if we look around the room at all of us, there are shared features we have, which are characteristic of our species. So, you know, looking at our heads, we've all got high rounded skulls, we've got small brow ridges, give or take a bit of variation. Large brain, of course, inside the cranium. The face is tucked under the cranial vault. On the lower jaw, we've got a chin, again subject to a bit of variation. And we've got a lightly built skeleton compared with our predecessors. So these are the shared features of modern humans. So we have to account for those shared species features. But then there are the differences. So again, if we look around the room, people come in different sizes, shapes and colours. And we have to explain the origins of those features as well. And it's very likely that those features, these two sets of features, evolved in different ways and over quite different timescales. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. So to start with, though, I'll be talking about, if you like, the shared features that characterise our species and where they fit into the shape of things. And there's also, of course, human behaviour to account for. So modern humans have complex technology. Even hunter-gatherers make quite elaborate tools, composite tools, made of several parts that fit together. We know that modern humans 35,000 years ago were already weaving and sewing in Europe during the last ice age. Humans tend to have permanent or semi-permanent dwellings, houses if you like. On the bottom left there, humans treat their dead in very complex ways. In this case, there is shown a burial from Russia about 25,000 years ago, where 2 adults and 2 children were buried together in graves, and in those graves were very elaborate objects made of mammoth ivory, and some of them include spears, which you can see there, made of mammoth ivory. And as you all know, mammoth tusks are actually curved, so to get a straight spear out of a mammoth tusk, you actually have to steam treat the ivory for weeks and weeks and then whittle it down to make a spear. So months and months of work has gone into the goods that are left in those graves. So we know that 25,000 years ago, these 4 people must have been extremely important in their group. So complex ways of treating the dead. And on the bottom right there, of course, art and symbolism, the fact that we communicate with each other symbolically, and we express ourselves through things like music and art. And just in the middle there, you can see a little statuette, a black statuette, and I've got a replica here of that statuette. It's the same size as the original. The original was made about 30,000 years ago in what's now the Czech Republic, and it's made of baked clay, baked to a very high temperature, clay mixed with bone meal, mixed together and baked to a very high temperature. As you can see, it's a statuette of a woman, quite shapely, and these so-called Venus statuettes are very widespread in Europe between about 15,000 and 30,000 years ago. Sometimes they're made of ivory, sometimes carved in stone, sometimes engraved on the walls of caves, but often they're like this sort of size and shape, often with a pointed base, so we think they were probably stuck in the ground when they were being used. So that kind of complexity characterises modern human behaviour. And of course this ultimately comes out of our brains, and so we've got this hypothesis, the social brain hypothesis, that a lot of the growth of our brain, of course some of it's to do with higher intelligence and thinking, but a lot of it's to do with mapping relationships, with predicting the behaviour of other species if we're hunting them, but also of other people in our group. So a lot of our brain on this hypothesis is to do with really kind of mind reading other people, mind reading species you're hunting, predicting their behaviour. So it seems that our brains then have partly got large through growing social complexity. So in terms of putting the story together, we have to get evidence from all kinds of sources. So I'm kind of coming in from the direction of paleontology on the top right there. I work on fossil human remains. Also, of course, we've got remains of fossil animals. We've got remains of beetles and plants that can help us reconstruct the environments in which early humans lived. There's the archaeological record over on the top left there, the record of stone tools, mostly stone tools, but obviously sometimes including objects like this little statuette if we get lucky to find exceptional things like that. And at the bottom there, what I've rather unkindly called contextual and other data, but this data of course is extremely important in the story, and in there we've got things like dating methods such as the famous method radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, geology, the use of isotopes which can be used to reconstruct the mobility of animals and humans in the past, which can be used to reconstruct ancient diets, and of course DNA, and you'll have heard about that from John Hawkes, and that's increasingly important in the story now. DNA not only from living humans but also, if we're lucky, from the fossils themselves. So here are some of those techniques in a little bit more detail. Over on the left there, CT study and reconstruction, the fact that we've got this medical imaging technique called computerized tomography, and this means that we can take a fossil skull, so this is a replica of a Neanderthal skull, but we can put that in a CT scan and we can get out of it hidden information. So where we've got the label CT study and reconstruction, that skull there is a fragmentary skull of a Neanderthal child that we've got in the museum in London. And here, using CT and mirror imaging, we've built up the whole shape of that child's skull, and we can see in there hidden structures. So the unerupted teeth that are still inside the jaw have been imaged there, and even the inner ear bones. So in there, of course, they're the bones of the inner ear. We've never physically seen them for many of the Neanderthal fossils, but with CT technology, we can actually look at these, and it's only with that technology that we learnt that the inner ear bones of Neanderthals are shaped slightly differently to our own. So that's been very important, and as you can see, we've even managed to CT scan Homer Simpson's brain there. Can you see his head there? Very small, of course, with just a single neuron coming out of it. So in the middle of the picture, we've got microscopic techniques such as scanning electron microscopy and the use of the synchrotron, and that's been important for looking at things like cut marks. So when humans are butchering animals, we can look at the way they're dismembering the animals they're hunting. We can look at growth lines in teeth and work out how quickly humans in the past were growing up compared with us today. Isotopes I've mentioned in the centre of the bottom there. An example here where the isotopes can tell you whether a creature is basically vegetarian or carnivorous, or whether it's eating marine resources such as fish. Direct dating, bottom left, mentioned the radiocarbon technique, which goes back to about 40 or maybe, if you're lucky, 50,000 years ago. And then there are other techniques which we can use to take us even further back in dating the fossils. And on the bottom right, DNA, which I'll come on to a bit later. So if we look at the big picture of human evolution, we think that we shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, maybe around 6-7 million years ago. Different experts have a slightly different take on that. And the first 5 million years or so of human evolution occurred only in Africa. Then about 2 million years ago, this top phase, the so-called human phase at the top there, humans got out of Africa for the first time and spread to some other parts of the old world. And as I've said there, in that stage, which is really what we're talking about today, the human phase, we've got several species, including us and the Neanderthals, for example, an increasingly global spread of humans, the development of a human anatomy, so the body shape becomes fully human in terms of having long legs, if you like, the perfection of walking upright as we do, increasingly encephalized, so the brain really starts to get large compared with the body size, an increasing dietary range, so moving from vegetable materials to meat eating and later on to the exploitation of aquatic and marine resources, and increasing behavioural complexity. And we'll certainly see some evidence of that. So we're concentrating then on this last 2 million years of time. And the start of this story really is that emergence from Africa nearly 2 million years ago. We think that this species, Homo erectus, got out of Africa, so starting on the conventional view in Africa, and then first of all moving into Western Asia. We find remains at Dmanisi in the Caucasus, and then later on over into China and Java by 1.5 million years ago, and by 1 million years ago certainly the descendants of Homo erectus are coming into Europe. And over on the right there we've got a reconstruction of a skeleton of a boy who died about 1.5 million years ago. He lived in Nariakotomi, what's now Nariakotomi, in northern Kenya, on the west side of Lake Turkana. And below the neck, this boy was fundamentally like us. He walked upright pretty well as we do, quite strongly built. He probably would have been nearly 6 foot tall had he grown up to an adult age. So below the neck, recognisably human, but above the neck, still very different from us. So the skull of Homo erectus was long and low, quite thick, this massive brow ridge over the eyes, big face, and on the lower jaw without any chin on it, so a receding lower jaw. So above the neck, quite different from us, and a brain size only about, on average, 1/2 or 2/3 of our average brain size today. So still evolutionary changes to go on, but technology begins to get more complicated, and on the bottom right there you can see some stone tools which were made by the very first humans in Africa and at Dmanisi in the Caucasus. About 1.82 million years ago, stone tools were extremely simple. Basically, cobbles were being broken to produce simple cutting edges to cut meat or plant materials, or they were being used to smash open bones of other animals to get the marrow out. But as time moves on the bottom right there, we can see that technology gets more sophisticated, artifacts are more complex, much more work goes into them, and we start to see increasing complexity in the technology. So the Neanderthals, we need to, even though they're late in the story, they're an important player in this story, and we know a lot about them because they had the helpful habit of burying their dead, just as we do. So in that sense, they're very like us. And they buried their dead in cave sites, so archaeologists can go to those cave sites and find quite complete Neanderthal skeletons that have been, if you like, saved from the usual destruction that happens. So by being buried, these bodies were not trampled or scavenged or otherwise eroded. So we have a pretty good idea of the Neanderthal body anatomy. And in the centre there in brown, you've got a Neanderthal skeleton, and in white, you've got a modern human skeleton. And right at the top in the middle there, you can see these different images of Neanderthals. And Neanderthals have had a bad time, and I'm sure John Hawkes talked about that if English soccer fans behave badly, they're called Neanderthals. If some reactionary American politician proposes nasty policies, they're called Neanderthals. So Neanderthals have got this image problem that goes back a very long way, but it's very unfair because they were very evolved humans in their own way, really as evolved as we were. As we are today. So their brains were as large as ours, they walked upright as well as we do. But they were different. I think they were, in my view, a distinct species. They had a separate evolutionary history. So the Neanderthal body was short and stocky, very powerfully built, very powerful upper body. And we look at a Neanderthal head on the bottom left there, and this is a Neanderthal skull from France. And there's a reconstruction of a Neanderthal man's head. And in there, of course, is a large brain, but the skull is differently shaped. It's much longer and lower. It's almost globular in rear view, whereas ours is more parallel-sided with more expansion in the parietal region. At the front, you've got this brow ridge, not as big as in Homo erectus, but still much bigger than any that you would find on a modern human, and particularly strongly marked this enormous nose. So, a lot of us have got big noses, high noses and wide noses and projecting noses. The Neanderthals had all three combined. So this was one of their really unique features, this enormous nose, accentuated because the cheekbones were swept back either side of it. So an extraordinary feature, quite specialised we would guess, and different arguments about it. One of the leading theories is that this nose is a kind of mechanism for humidifying and warming up cold air. So the Neanderthals evolved, the story goes, in predominantly colder and drier environments in the ice ages of Europe and Asia. And this is a mechanism, so they're being very active, they're breathing out a lot of warm, moist air, they're breathing in a lot of cold, dry air, and this very large nasal cavity is humidifying and warming up the air before it goes down and might damage the lungs or cool down the base of the brain. So there might be selection for this big nose. And the Neanderthals are important because for a long time they were considered to be direct ancestors for modern humans. And so when I did my PhD, starting in 1970, this was one of the leading ideas that I was testing in my PhD, whether the Neanderthals made reasonable ancestors for modern humans. So on the left there we've got Loring Brace's view, and Brace's argument really was that the Neanderthals were in the right time and the right place to be our ancestors, and that all over the world there was sort of a Neanderthal-like phase leading to modern humans. And on the right there we've got a more detailed model, the multi-regional model, which I'm sure John Hawkes will have talked about a bit. And this argues that really the evolution of modern humans is a process that's been going on for nearly 2 million years. That Homo erectus, once it started to spread nearly 2 million years ago, in each part of the world, Homo erectus started to evolve towards modern humans. But these lines of erectus didn't diverge, as you would expect them to do, because they were interbreeding with each other. So gene flow kind of glued them together. And on that model, there isn't any single place where modern humans originated. Basically, modern humans evolved everywhere that ancient humans lived. So in Europe, the Neanderthals would be part of the ancestry of modern Europeans. Homo erectus in Java was an ancestor for Australian Aborigines. Homo erectus in China would be an ancestor for modern Oriental populations. So this is a kind of global model of the evolution of modern humans. And so here I am in 1970, beginning my PhD trip around Europe. In fact, that was 1971 actually. I'm in Yugoslavia. So I had my old car driving around for about 4 months and did about 5,000 miles, visited really all the European museums that I could get to measure all the available Neanderthal fossils and all the available fossils of early modern humans. And then using a primitive computer in Bristol University that was about the size of this room but had less computing power than my watch, that computer then, I fed all these skull measurements into the computer to try and see whether the Neanderthals, in terms of the shape of their skull, were reasonable ancestors for modern humans or not. And, sorry, there's an awful lot on this diagram, but this was my attempt in 1974 because we didn't have any computers to draw diagrams then, so this is a hand-drawn diagram summarising my PhD results. And so you can see on the top right there, we've got modern humans, a group of skulls which we could call modern. And I had a sample of 400 modern skulls from all over the world, so those were nested also in that area where it says modern. And then down the bottom, you can see Homo erectus skulls from China and Java, and some archaic skulls from Europe and Africa. And the Neanderthals, you can see, are kind of over on the left of the diagram. And so what I could conclude straight away was that if you were trying to go from these ancient skulls down the bottom left to modern humans on the top right, the Neanderthals did not make good intermediates in terms of the shape of the skull. They were going off in their own evolutionary direction, and the fossils in Africa, these ones here, might represent better ancestors for modern humans. But at that time, a lot of discoveries were still to be made, a lot of these fossils weren't well dated, so it was actually very difficult to make an evolutionary sequence. But it didn't seem to me that the Neanderthals were likely ancestors for us, even in Europe. So we can turn that model into the modern version, and this is sort of, the sort of diagram that I used to draw a few years ago anyway. So here's Homo erectus evolving probably in Africa, close to 2 million years ago, carrying on in the Far East for a long time in Java and China. This species, Homo antecessor, pioneer man, we won't talk about that, but that maybe is a little European branch that died out. But in Europe and Africa, we get a new species about 500,000 years ago called Homo heidelbergensis, named after a jawbone found in Germany near Heidelberg in 1907. So for me, that species is a reasonable last common ancestor for the Neanderthals and modern humans. So Homo heidelbergensis split about 400,000 or 500,000 years ago on this model. And north of the Mediterranean, it gave rise to the Neanderthals. South of the Mediterranean in Africa, it gave rise to us, Homo sapiens. And then later on, we came out of Africa and spread. So that's the sort of basis of the out of Africa model, really. A common ancestor maybe 500,000 years ago, and then a split, and in Africa, just the evolution of modern humans, only occurring in Africa. So let's look at that African record, and the first thing we have to bear in mind is that Africa is a huge place. We can fit China, India, Europe, and lots of space to spare into that continent. So it's a massive area, and we've got a good archaeological record from all over the continent of Africa, but actually we know who are making those stone tools in less than 50% of those cases. So we've got a reasonable fossil record in Africa from Kenya, from Ethiopia, from South Africa, but as we'll see, from places like Central and West Africa, we've got virtually nothing to tell us who was living there. And that we must bear that in mind, that actually the stories we're building up are based still on really quite incomplete data from Africa. But we can date that fossil record increasingly well in Africa. So here are some African fossils which in various ways show mixtures of the features of Homo heidelbergensis and of Homo sapiens. And here's a CT scan of a heidelbergensis skull from Zambia, which we've got in the museum in London, the Broken Hill skull, and here's a modern human skull. So we can see that the evolution of modern humans from heidelbergensis has got to turn a skull like this into a skull like that. And it's only in Africa, in my view, that we can find fossils that show intermediate features between those two species. So for me, Africa is the place where the shared features of modern humans evolved. That high rounded skull, the chin, and the lightly built skeleton. But the way in which we evolved in Africa, I think, is still subject to a lot of doubt. And this is an area of research now where we're learning a lot, that the picture is probably a lot more complicated than many of us thought. So the standard idea has really been kind of that you've had a gradual evolutionary change in Africa. So here's that Broken Hill skull of Homo heidelbergensis. Here's a modern human skull from Ethiopia that's 160,000 years old, and here's a later modern human skull. So the view has been that given enough time, you have a gradual transition right through to modern humans. But as we'll see, when you look in detail at the fossil record, it's actually a bit more complicated than that. And there's an awful lot of variation in these intermediate fossils. So all of these fossils here date between 120,000 and 250,000 years ago from all over Africa. They're from Morocco, from Ethiopia, from Tanzania, the Sudan and so on. But they show an incredible amount of variation. So in my book I explain how I've kind of gone from the idea that there was like a single centre, a sort of Garden of Eden, if you like, in Africa, where it all happened. I mean, I wrote a book called African Exodus in 1996 with the journalist Robin McKee. And there I took the view that there probably was one place in Africa where a small group of proto-modern humans got isolated. And that, with climatic change, they got isolated. And in that region, we saw the very rapid development of modern humans and of modern human behaviour from that small group. Then they spread out and basically took over the world. Well, I don't think that's what happened anymore. I think that different parts of Africa were probably contributing to the story. And there isn't going to be a single centre for the origin of modern humans. And when we look at behaviour, we can certainly see that Africa also has deep evidence for the origins of some of these aspects of modern human behaviour that we've talked about. So down the bottom, yes, we've got some modern skulls, 150 or 200,000 years old, but also we've got evidence of jewellery made from shells. So shells in Morocco, in South Africa, in Algeria, even just popping up into Israel, modern humans are making jewellery out of shells. They're boring holes in them, and they're putting these onto strings, we assume, which are rotted away, to make pendants or necklaces. And often they're colouring them. So these shells might be coloured with red ochre, or they may be stained with manganese oxide to look black. So they were probably stringing these even in threads of different colours. So symbolism, sort of this kind of showing off, if you like, sending signals to each other, is going on in Africa more than 100,000 years ago. And the use of pigments is going back even further. So red pigments were being used in Africa more than 150,000 years ago. We find these in sites sometimes 50 miles away from the source of the red ochre. And these pieces have been cut to make a crayon. So they're marking something with this red ochre. Unfortunately, it doesn't survive whatever they were marking. Maybe their own bodies, maybe the cave walls and the evidence has fallen off. But certainly there are large amounts of pigments in these sites. Marine resource exploitation goes back 150,000 years at least in Africa, and also the use of complex technology. The fact that people 150,000 years ago were mounting stone blades onto wooden handles. So you've got the beginning of composite technology in Africa 150,000 years ago. And this behaviour is spread right over the range of modern humans 100,000 years ago. We've got it up in Algeria and Morocco, down in South Africa, and here's a red ochre plaque from Blombos Cave in South Africa. So this is a slab of red ochre that's been rubbed down to make it parallel-sided, and then it's been incised with a series of crisscross designs. And when that ochre was fresh, that colour would have been vivid red, the colour of blood. So that kind of behaviour is going on, and the use of shell jewellery over the whole range of modern humans. And how did this behaviour spread? Well, today, of course, there's a major barrier in North Africa that would stop much of that spread of ideas and people. But 120,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert wasn't there as a desert. It was green. It had huge lakes and river systems, and we can track these from satellite imagery, we can track them from geology. And so the whole of North Africa was relatively well watered, and there were stone tools can be found all over the Sahara now where people don't live today. You can find stone tools in these riverbeds to show us that people were living there 100 and 120,000 years ago. So I think this helps to explain how that behaviour of the use of red pigments, of the use of shell jewellery, could have spread right over Africa when the Sahara was much greener and wetter than it is at the present day. But the complex climates of Africa, we have to remember that Africa isn't a simple place in terms of its climates. So it's affected by the climates of the Mediterranean, of the South Atlantic, to the south of the Antarctic oceans, and to the east it's affected by the monsoons from coming off the Indian Ocean. So different bits of Africa are going to get different signals at different times. So whereas the main message in the north, where the Neanderthals were living, is the ice ages. So things are cycling through extreme cold, huge growth of ice caps, and then the retreat of the ice caps and it warms up again, then the whole cycle begins again. In Africa, even at lower temperatures, the main features are going to be ones of aridity, of rainfall. It's really rainfall in Africa that's going to be the important determinant of whether people can live there. And when we look at the African story, we see really quite an interesting picture that population size seems to be fluctuating in different parts of Africa. So 150,000 years ago, indeed Africa was overall a very arid place. And we think that modern humans, the ancestral modern humans, were pinned into little pockets of people surviving in little corners of Africa. Then about 120,000 years ago, the Sahara is green and the whole of North Africa seems to be a much more fertile environment. And we've got evidence of, as I say, stone tools covering the whole range of where the Sahara Desert is today. And then we get to about 60,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert has now increased in size. We have very little evidence for humans living there, and the evidence now switches to South and East Africa, where we've got larger numbers of modern humans. So it's likely that the real story of human evolution will be a complex one, that the centre of evolution will have moved around depending where people were able to survive in large enough numbers. So I think it's going to be quite a complicated story when we get the whole picture through. I'm sorry, there's a lot of writing here. And I think this is true also for human behaviour, because I think, as it says here today, this is just a quote from something I wrote, we may be misled by recent human history where information storage in spoken, written or electronic form means that useful innovations are rarely lost, and the growth of cultural knowledge is incremental or even exponential. So today good ideas take hold very quickly and they're spread very quickly. That's because there's a lot of us and there's lots of ways to store that information. But in the past, small populations would have been prone to extinction or forced into relatively rapid movement or adaptation to survive. And this could have led to the regular loss of innovations that might have been useful in the longer term. Thus, repeated bottlenecking, in other words, population crashes down to small size, did not just remove genes and genetic diversity, but also discoveries and inventions associated with the human population concerned. Because this is one of the puzzles that I've mentioned, that we've got these innovations showing up in various bits of Africa. But when you look at the African record, these innovations kind of appear and then they may disappear again. So it looks like bows and arrows were in use in South Africa 65 or 70,000 years ago. But by 50,000 years ago, all trace of these tiny arrowheads vanish. It's as though those people have forgotten how to make bows and arrows. So that's something we don't find today. Good ideas take hold, but in the past, with small populations, sometimes good ideas did not take hold and things had to be reinvented all over again. And I think that shows why cultural progress was, for a long time, such a stop-start and slow process. There's a classic case in the recent past, I won't go into detail on this, but Tasmania, the island of Tasmania off the south coast of Australia, 15 or 20,000 years ago, there was a large human population there, and their behaviour was very sophisticated. They were fishing, they had ocean-going watercraft, they were, really had quite varied technology. But about 15,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended, sea levels started to rise. And by about 12,000 years ago, Tasmania was an island cut off from the rest of Australia. So before that, those populations were in contact with the populations of mainland Australia. After that, they were isolated on their island. Not only that, the environment changed. So rather than being relatively open country, which suits hunter-gatherers, suddenly Tasmania became heavily forested and population numbers crashed. And we can show from looking at the cultural diversity of the Tasmanians that they actually progressively lost some of these ideas that they had. So they stopped making boats, they even stopped fishing. So their way of life became simpler and simpler. And this seems to be a result of this loss, this contraction in population size, and the loss of contact with their neighbours to the north in mainland Australia. So there's a huge literature about this now and how ideas spread, and we had a conference at the Royal Society called Culture Evolves last year, and you can get the volume where a lot of these ideas are discussed. So I think that what's important is that what's limiting the Neanderthals and these earlier humans is their small population sizes, their small group sizes, and their small networks with their neighbours. So they're living in small groups without too much contact with the neighbouring people. So ideas actually get transmitted rather slowly and in limited areas. But with modern humans, I think we've got evidence that transmission of knowledge really steps up to a whole new level. So with modern humans, we see the first evidence of really long-term survival of people into old age. Now, once you've got old people around, they're obviously socially useful in the sense that they can help to look after their children or their grandchildren and provide social support. With the development of weaving and traps and snares, these older people can also collect food for the group. You don't have to be a big game hunter. You can suddenly get food more locally using new technology. And so with more older people around, you've also got more knowledge storage. So these people who are 50 or 60 years old might remember the last time all the water holes dried out and how you coped. Whereas for the Neanderthals, most of them were dead by the age of 35 or 40. So with modern humans, you've got much greater transfer between the generations of knowledge, and you've also got much greater networks. We can show this because objects get traded and move around with modern humans. So in Africa, raw materials to make stone tools are sometimes travelling over 100 miles. Some of these shell beads are found 100 miles inland from the coast. So there's obviously long distance movements and transmissions of ideas. So with modern humans, you've got intergenerational transfer going on of information between the generations, and you've also got much more group contact between neighbouring groups. So knowledge can be stored and conserved, and I think that's what helped modern humans to move on in terms of cultural progress. But I think overall the picture is really not the one on the left there, which I used to believe in, that basically physically and behaviourally, if we had the full record of modern humans, I used to think that we just see this nice steady progression to us through time, but it's much more like this pattern on the right, a kind of piecemeal coalescence of modern humans from different bits of Africa, and as we'll see, even from some bits outside of Africa as well, adding into the picture of what we now call modern humanity. So modern humans, about 60,000 years ago, having evolved in Africa, they finally come out of Africa. They start to come out of Africa into the Middle East. And we can look back at that migration through genetics. So on the top there, a rather unfamiliar picture I stole from Wikipedia, looking down on the Earth from North Pole. You can see here tracking the dispersion of mitochondrial DNA. So this is the DNA, of course, inherited through females, and we're tracking here a mitochondrial origin in Africa, maybe 150,000 years ago, with the modern human variations, then moving out to Western Asia, and eventually to Australia, into Asia, and eventually into the Americas. And we can put timescales on these movements of these mitochondrial lineages and their evolution. And we can do the same thing for males through the Y chromosome. So looking at Y chromosomes, we're tracking the evolution of male DNA, and we can track again its origin in Africa and its spread out eastwards, eventually into the Americas and Australia and into Europe. So this genetic data has been very useful for tracking human movements. And it brings us back to that question I talked about at the beginning, these two different kinds of origins for modern humans. So on the left there, our species features, the features we share, as I mentioned, the large brain, the high round skull, small face, a chin on the lower jaw, a small brow ridges and a lightly built skeleton. Those features evolved in Africa. So our shared features evolved in Africa, and we can find African fossils with those features 100 or 150,000 years old. But what about the features on the right? Well, those features seem to have evolved over a much shorter time scale. So the modern regional so-called racial differences seem to be added on to that shared modern template. So first we got the evolution of the shared features of modern humans, and then added onto those shared features we have the differences between human populations. So all that diversity there, the recent African origin model argues that that diversity is a product mostly of the last 60,000 years. So as modern humans dispersed and spread, these features developed because modern humans spread in small numbers and they moved to new environments. So moving north, there was obviously the evolution of lighter skins to make the best of the reduced sunlight, the reduced ultraviolet light, because we need UV light to hit our skins to make vitamin D. So basically lighter pigmentation evolved in the north, so lighter skins evolved, and these other features, well, we've got to account for those as well. So the different features of the eyes, of the lips, of the noses, some of those pretty certainly are climatically driven too, but Darwin, of course, was always cautious about that. He, in The Descent of Man, argued that a lot of these, he could see that skin colour might well be controlled by environmental factors, but he couldn't really see why the different hair forms would have evolved, why the different eye shapes would have evolved. And he thought that sexual selection might well be at work. In other words, cultural preferences within groups for particular kinds of beauty or attractiveness could have driven some of these differences through time. And just to make the point, I think some people find that the most difficult bit of the argument, that, you know, these differences look quite marked to us when we look at someone from a different area. We see, you know, their head, which is the first thing we see. We might see very different hair forms, skin colour, and so on. So it looks quite profound, but it's very tiny amounts of DNA involved in producing those differences. And here at the bottom there, courtesy of Benetton, on the bottom right we've got a woman whose one parent is African American and the other parent is Native American. So that's what she looks like, bottom right. And there she is in the other pictures, looking Oriental or European or African. It's the same woman, and okay, she's got contact lenses and makeup, but it's the same woman. So what I think that says is if a makeup artist can do that kind of thing in a couple of hours, then natural selection and sexual selection and founder effect and drift produce those differences as modern humans spread around the world. So these really are quite recently evolved, not much DNA involved in them. So they're added on to those original shared modern human features. But we've got some unfinished business, of course, because when modern humans came out of Africa about 60,000 years ago into the Middle East and then started to spread, they were obviously going to encounter the other kinds of humans who were living outside of Africa. And the first work on DNA mitochondrial DNA of Neanderthals suggested that Neanderthals were indeed a separate lineage. They separated from our line of evolution maybe 400,000 or 500,000 years ago, and there was no sign of any interbreeding, looking just at the mitochondrial DNA between us and Neanderthals. But nevertheless, some people thought, looking at the fossils, that they could see in some of the early modern human skeletons in Europe what they thought were traces of Neanderthal features that might indicate there had been some interbreeding. And I was certainly very cautious about these. And I always thought that interbreeding was possible, but if it happened only on a small scale 40,000 years ago between us and Neanderthals, all trace of it had probably vanished by the time we get to the present day. And in calling Neanderthals a different species, I never thought, on the biological species concept, that meant we couldn't interbreed with them. So I've always felt that interbreeding was possible because we only separated from them maybe 400,000 years ago. And when we look at other mammalian species, here's a foal, and the mother of that foal is the mare behind, and the father is a zebra. Now, because zebras and horses don't meet in the wild, but they meet in game parks and zoos, and they can hybridise. Now, in the case of zebras and horses, the offspring are usually not fertile, but they've been separate for probably 3 or 4 times as long as we and Neanderthals were separate. So a lot of mammal species that are closely related can hybridise. Jackals and wolves can, bonobos and common chimpanzees can hybridise and produce fertile offspring. So it certainly was possible for Neanderthals, but the question was, had it happened? Well, we now know from the much more complete genomic work of Neanderthals that indeed it did happen. And we're getting snippets of features out. I expect John Hawkes talked about the ginger hair gene in Neanderthals, and the press had a field day when the genome showed that Neanderthals had ginger hair. So we have pictures of celebrities like Ginger Spice and Mick Hucknall saying, look, they're all Neanderthals. And of course the press didn't get it right, because the melanocortin mutations in Neanderthal DNA are actually different to the ones in modern humans. So the Neanderthals developed lighter pigmentation and lighter skin and hair colour in a different way to we did. And that's not surprising, because they were in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before we were. So they went down their own path of producing lighter skin. And the modern human mutations for lighter skin and things like ginger hair are much more recent. They seem to date only to the last 20 or 30,000 years. But we were able to map the diversity of Neanderthals from this genetic work, and of course the divergence of them seemed to be, again as we've said, about 400,000 years. But the surprise came with the publication last year of the most complete genomic sequences, and evidence, as it says here, the long-awaited, running on reserve battery power, I hope that's not bad news. Yeah, okay. The long-awaited sequence of the Neanderthal genome suggests that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred tens of thousands of years ago, perhaps in the Middle East. And in there, we've got, comparing the genomes, we've got something like 100 bits of DNA where we're different from the Neanderthals and different from chimpanzees, where we can say that modern humans have got a derived condition. And those derived conditions are, some of them in DNA that seems to be concerned with the brain, some concerned with the skin and physiology, some concerned with motility of sperm. So these seem to be differences that we've evolved since we split off from the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals have got their own features, such as their own way of evolving ginger hair. But certainly there was interbreeding, and in terms of our human DNA, separate from chimpanzees, so we share 98 and 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but of the remaining component, people outside of Africa have about a 2.5% input of Neanderthal DNA. Thanks. And the surprises didn't stop there as well, of course. And so we've got the apparent appearance then of modern humans come out of Africa, somewhere around here. They seem to evolve with some Neanderthals, pick up about 2.5% of that Neanderthal DNA and take it with them into Europe, over into the Far East and down into Australasia, over into the Americas as well. But there was another surprise, as I've mentioned, published on Christmas Eve last year. This cave in Siberia, Denisovan cave, very fragmentary fossils there, but a distinct type of DNA discovered, a distinct kind of human related to the Neanderthals but different from them, and in the case of the genome comparison, so whereas with the Neanderthal DNA, the comparison was the reconstructed genome of the Neanderthal was reconstructed with 5 modern human genomes from 2 from Africa, the Yoruba and San, 1 from China, 1 from France, and 1 from New Guinea. We found that the Chinese, the European, and the New Guinean were 2.5% closer to the Neanderthal genome than were the 2 African samples, the Yoruba and San. But with the Denisovan genome, compared with a much larger range of modern human genomes, there was only one area where you could pick up the influence of Denisovan DNA, and that was down in Australasia, in New Guinea, and we now know in Australia as well. And the input of genes there is about 5%. So the incredible thing is that the Australasian populations not only have picked up their 2.5% of Neanderthal DNA, but they then got added to it about 5% of DNA from these mysterious people called the Denisovans, who we assume were living over quite a wide area of Asia. And down in Southeast Asia, there must have been an interbreeding event as the ancestors of the Australasians were passing through this region. And it doesn't stop there. When we look at Africa, obviously we can look at probably a similar situation to us and these other archaic species. So Cliff Jolly has looked at baboon species in Africa. Now these look like good species. They morphologically are distinct, they're behaviourally distinct, and a lot of their DNA is distinct. But once you map them in detail, you find that where these species are overlapping, they are exchanging a bit of DNA. So that seems to be the situation for us and our archaic relatives. And even just recently published in the last 2 weeks, even within Africa, it looks like there might have been some archaic humans lurking there who were feeding some DNA into our African ancestors. And we published a study last week in PLOS One of a skull from Nigeria. So I mentioned that from Western Central Africa we've got virtually no evidence of human evolution. This skull from Nigeria, from Iwo Eleru, is only about 13,000 years old. It's the oldest human fossil from the whole of West Africa. But it seems to be really quite primitive looking, quite surprisingly primitive, to be only 13,000 years old. So even the African story is going to be more complex. So this is kind of how I look at the big picture, if you like, of human evolution over the last 2 million years. We've got this weird thing called the Hobbit, living over in Flores. Haven't had time to talk about that. Homo erectus probably originated in Africa. There is an argument it might have originated in Asia and come back into Africa. It gives rise to Homo antecessor in Europe, but that dies out. And erectus then carries on in China and Java for a long time. Over in the western part of the old world, we get the evolution of Homo heidelbergensis, which splits into Neanderthals and Denisovans. In Africa it becomes modern humans. But we now know that the Neanderthals did not go completely extinct. There's a little bit of gene flow into some modern human groups outside of Africa, in fact all of the human groups outside of Africa, and the Denisovans even put a little bit of DNA into the populations of Southeast Asia. And as I've mentioned, even evidence that some of the archaic genes, maybe of Heidelbergensis, lingered in Africa and again are being input into modern humans in the last 50,000 years. So really quite a complicated story, but quite an exciting one for the next generation of researchers to unravel. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
You've got all this morphological data which you did with a PhD on different small shapes and sizes, and now we've got genetic data for at least some subspecies. And we know from molecular biology that certain genes are involved in morphology, such as Fox genes. Has anybody tried to correlate the morphology we see in schools with the genes?
Only in a very primitive way. I mean, I did a paper with Tim Weaver and Charles Roseman, where we actually tested the divergent states of modern humans and Neanderthals based on morphological data. So basically, 20 Neanderthals, the skulls I've measured, we used their cranial measurements to estimate divergent states using the same technique which is used to assuming neutral evolution, drift, basically drift. Assuming that, using a method that is used to date microsatellites. We applied that to Neanderthals and modern humans, and we got a divergence state of 370,000, which actually matched the genetic divergence very well. But I guess what you're really getting at is a more direct link between genes and morphology. And really it's...
I'm assuming when you're showing this rules
yeah.
that the brow must evolve in a linear way, but we don't know if
yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's any...
We've got a fossil record, obviously, that shows us the changes in size of the brow ridge, and obviously with modern humans, we can see the brow ridge in Africa getting smaller. But I talk in the book about the brow ridge, and it is really quite a puzzle, this structure. You know, the standard view has been that this brow ridge is somehow a kind of reinforcement mechanism. So the simple idea was, you know, these primitive humans are chomping bones and things, and there's a lot of force being generated, and this brow ridge is there to kind of spread those forces so they don't cause damage in bone structure. But the fact is that the biggest brow ridges in Homo heidelbergensis skulls actually have huge air spaces right across them. There's very little compact bone in that brow ridge. So I speculate in here, in line with Bjorn Coten, the paleontologist, that this brow ridge might even be a signalling system, that it's a bit like antlers in deer, that actually if these Homo erectus guys were frowning at each other and aggressively staring, this brow ridge might have accentuated that aggressive stare. When you get to modern humans, of course, we've got bling and we've got weapons, and so we've got other ways of showing off, so the brow ridge is no longer needed for that signalling. I mean, it's a pretty show, but they're really, for me, not a very convincing explanation. I mean, this brow ridge is there for 1.5 million years, and I don't think we really know why it's there. And in terms of genetic control, it's obviously stable right for that whole period of time. It's a bit bigger in males than it is in females, but it is there. It develops really at the onset of puberty. So it's, you know, the Neanderthal kids don't have a brow ridge, but obviously it starts to develop about the age of 7 or 8 or 9, and then develops to full size in their teens. So we've got a bit about its ontogeny, but the genes behind it, very difficult one. But what's interesting is, you know, I mentioned those genes where we can say we're different to the Neanderthals and chimpanzees, and some of those are concerned with bone growth, because we know about them often because of anomalies of pathology. So when people get mutations in those areas, they have defects in skeletal growth. They may have a strange-shaped rib cage and an extremely bossed skull. So this suggests that those areas are doing something important in controlling the growth of the skeleton and making us different from Neanderthals. But it's all very early days, I'm afraid.